morning. It is great to see you here to celebrate the resurrection with us. If you're watching online, we're glad that you're watching. I have a lot of people are at spring break. I've had people sending me pictures all morning of different places where they're watching. So I've seen a couple pictures of the beach, seen one picture of Disney World, a couple pictures from the Smoky Mountains. And as it turns out, most of the people that were sending pictures, I didn't like them much anyway. So they kind of sealed the deal. But if you're watching online, we're glad you're watching. Hope you have a great time wherever you are. Every year, Easter is important. But this year, to me at least, it seems like our celebration of Easter has come at a time when it's desperately needed. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but as you look around, there is a lot going on. Globally, there's a lot going on. Expanding wars, economic challenges, intensifying rivalries, and that's just sort of scratching the surface of what you see on the nightly news. You look around our country, even within the borders of our own nation, there's a lot going on. Deepening political division, rising costs, a looming recession, school shootings, eroding values, an addiction epidemic, and on it goes. But you know, for most people, it's not what's happening in the world that weighs us down as much as it is what's happening in our world. So maybe as you look, maybe you're overwhelmed just by the sheer number of things that you have going. Maybe you look at your calendar and you just can't believe how many things you're expected to do and how many places you're expected to be. And that doesn't even count all the things you have to taxi your kids to. And maybe it's all good things. I mean, it could be that most of the things happening in your life are pretty good. And it may all be things that you signed up for, but it can still be overwhelming. For most of us, though, the things that weigh us down are not necessarily the things we signed up for, but it's the things that we didn't sign up for, but are still happening. Can be especially frustrating when what's going on around you is not at all what you hoped would be going on. And maybe that's where you find yourself this morning. You come to a day like today, and there are a lot of different reasons that people come to church on Easter. Some of you are here because you're always here, and so it would feel weird if you weren't here. Some of you are here because somebody invited you, and you knew it would be easier to come than it would be to explain to them why you weren't coming. Others of you are here simply because it's Easter, and if you weren't here, you would feel a little bit guilty. But however you're here, whatever your reason is, there are at least a few of us, and maybe even a lot of us, who could use a fresh infusion of hope. I love the way D.A. Carson said this in a book. He said this. He said, "You are not suffering from anything that a good resurrection can't fix." That's true. So with that in mind, I want you to turn your Bible to Luke 24. This morning, we're going to look at the story of two people who, just like some of us, were in desperate need of a fresh infusion of hope, because for them, the things that were going on around them were not anything like the things that they had hoped would be going on. And so as the story opens, we find these two travelers living under a heavy cloud of hopelessness. Just to set the scene for you, what we're going to look at happens late in the day on the very first Easter Sunday. After spending what had to have been a whirlwind week in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, these two travelers, who some scholars believe may have even been a married couple, have just left Jerusalem, and they're heading back to their home, a little village that's set 7 miles to the west of Jerusalem called Emmaus. And for them, and for a lot of other people, it had been a week unlike any other. Because they lived so close to Jerusalem, it's likely they had spent all week there, which means they most likely had been in the crowd the previous Sunday that lined the streets as Jesus made what we call his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. By that point, many of the people in and around Jerusalem were convinced that Jesus might actually be the Messiah who was finally making his move to overthrow the Romans, to seize power, and to restore the kingdom of Israel. But then, over the course of just 4 days, the tides turned so dramatically that the very same people who on Sunday afternoon had lined the streets and welcomed Jesus as a king, on Friday of that same week are demanding that he be crucified. And so that's exactly what happened. On Thursday night, he was arrested. made to stand a trial in which the verdict was already predetermined before being placed between two thieves and publicly executed. And for the people who were convinced that Jesus was the one they had been waiting on, that was a bitter pill to swallow. Their hero was now dead. The Romans are still in charge. The corrupt religious leaders are still behind the scenes pulling all the strings. So from their perspective, not only had nothing changed, but somehow the world had grown even darker. And that's where we pick up the story in verse 13 of Luke 24. After a week in which all their hopes had come up empty, these two weary travelers are headed home, and as they journeyed back home, they inevitably found themselves talking about everything that had gone wrong, and it's in the middle of that discussion that they're interrupted by a mysterious stranger who somehow seems vaguely familiar. I want you to look at this with me, Luke 24, verse 13. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing. Now, the way Luke describes this, just so you know, this is not like a dispassionate conversation between two uninterested observers. This is not that. These are two broken-hearted people looking at each other and asking the question, where do we go from here? Where in the world can we turn now? You've had those same kinds of conversations. Think about something goes wrong in your life, what do? You look for somebody to talk to, and if you can't find somebody to talk to, you get on social media and you pour it out for everybody else to see, because that's just what we do. In this instance, they are so devastated by everything that's happened that they miss what was actually happening. And so Jesus realizes what's happening, and he enters the conversation. I want you to look how he does this in verse 17. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened here in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priest and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." I want you to go back to that line in verse 21 where it says, "But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel." It's one of the saddest verses in the Bible. You can almost hear the bitter disappointment dripping off their words. For the first century Jewish person, their hope was primarily a political hope. Just like some people today, they were convinced if we could just get the right person in the right office, then he'll defeat all of our enemies, our economy will start growing again, and everything will be right with the world. But by this point, it was clear that nothing had turned out like they'd hoped. That's why they use the past tense. It's no longer we hope, but it's we had hoped. As you think back over your life, you've probably said something very similar. You've probably used some variation of that same statement. You may not have been looking for the redemption of Israel like these guys were, but you were looking for something else, and when it didn't turn out as you expected, left you feeling a little bit disillusioned, a little bit discouraged, and maybe even a little hopeless. I had hoped this job would be the one that finally fulfilled me. I had hoped that she or he would be the one that I would spend the rest of my life with. I had hoped that when I hit that number in my IRA, that I'd finally be happy. I'd hoped that when I bought that car or bought that house, that everything would satisfy me, everything would be right, but it just doesn't feel. I mean, I'd hoped that this year was going to be different than the previous years, but now it's April and it doesn't feel much different. We've all had high hopes. And maybe as you look back over your life, you realize that things have not turned out quite like you hoped. That's where these two people on the road to Emmaus were. That's why at the end of verse 21, they bring attention to the fact that it's now the third day since everything had gone off the rails. In the first century Jewish world, they had this belief that whenever a person died, their soul or their spirit would hang around their body for 3 days before leaving. So now that it's the third day, there's a mark of finality. And by reiterating this point, Luke is just telling us that this was the end of the line. This means that all hope has been lost. It's now been 3 days and nothing has happened and nobody knows what to do and nobody knows where to turn. But then you get to verse 22 and the door to hope cracks open ever so slightly as one of these two travelers mentions that they've heard this strange report that Jesus' body is now missing. Now, they don't have any idea how to make sense of that. They're not even sure that it's true. But when you're hopeless, something is better than nothing. And the report they've heard is something. So it's at that point that Jesus decides to take the conversation in a new direction. And what you see over the next few verses is a resurgence of hope. In the course of just one conversation, Jesus takes these two brokenhearted, hopeless travelers, and he moves them from hopelessness to hope-filled. So if you're here this morning and you're in need of a fresh infusion of hope, I hope you'll pay attention to how he does it. So if you're keeping track in your bulletin, here's the first thing. If you want to experience a resurgence of hope, according to this passage, you have to listen to the story. So you get to verse 25, and after listening to these two travelers explain their situation, Jesus interrupts and he tells them a story that they had heard all their lives, just like some of you. Only this time, he reframes the story and he makes it clear that the story is actually about him. Look at how it does this in verse 25. He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. So you go back to verse 13. Luke tells us it was a 7-mile journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus, where these two people are from. So I looked it up this week, and according to researchers, the average person, it takes them anywhere from 19 to 22 minutes to walk a mile. That's without, straining. 19 to 22 minutes. So think about these two guys, or these two people, after the week they've had, they're talking to Jesus. Let's just say it took them, 25 minutes to walk a mile. That means that it took them right at 3 hours, plus or minus, to cover the ground from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And what are they doing during those 3 hours? They're having a Bible study with Jesus. And Jesus goes through and he takes them back to the Old Testament and he shows them how everything they've spent their life hearing about the Old Testament foreshadows everything that's happened over the course of the last week. And he does all of that in 3 hours. Now, for sake of comparison, I'm only going to preach about half that long today. So, no, I'm kidding. I'm kind of kidding. But I want you to think about this. Of all the ways Jesus could have chosen to reveal himself, this is by far the least dramatic and the most tedious. I mean, if Jesus had wanted to, he could have appeared like on the steps of the temple with 100,000 angels all blowing trumpets and waving banners that says, he's back. If he'd have wanted to, he could have snuck up. Can you imagine, it's very early Sunday morning, before sunrise, and Pontius Pilate wakes up and he sees Jesus standing at the end of his bed. Can you imagine Caiaphas, the high priest, who orchestrated all this? Can you imagine him getting up and going to get his breakfast, and he goes into his little kitchen, and there's such Jesus. And Jesus says, "Hey, I know you thought you got rid of me, but surprise." I mean, can you imagine? That's probably what I would have done. But instead of doing something like that, Jesus shows up on a back road to two people that are walking away from where all the action took place. So why did he do it that way? I think he did it that way because he wanted them to have a solid understanding of their faith and not just an emotional experience that will soon wear off. I think he wanted them to know what they believed and why they believed it rather than living off the fleeting emotion of one dramatic moment. Keep in mind that by this point, they'd already heard the rumors about the tomb being empty. They just didn't know how to process it. And so in this extended conversation with him, Jesus gives them the backstory so that they can understand what's happened. Now, some of you are here this morning, and you've heard this story all your life. You know all the details. You could piece it together. You could tell the story to somebody else. But underneath all of that, you still have some unanswered questions. And if that describes your situation, here's what I want to encourage you to do. Sometime over the next few days, go back and just listen to the story. Go back to Luke chapter 1. Read through the entire Gospel of Luke. When you get done with that, just keep reading and read through John. If you have questions about what you're reading, there are lots of people that would love to sit down with you and help you understand the story. But this all starts with you making a commitment to listen with fresh ears and begin to allow the Lord to put the pieces together. Now, here's the second step to experiencing resurgence of hope, and that's that after listening to the story, you have to invite Jesus in. So you get to verse 28. After spending all afternoon on the road, they finally arrived home, and when they did, one of these two travelers makes a split-second decision that changes everything. I want you to look at this with me, verse 28. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. Now, in the ancient world, hospitality was a highly valued part of the culture. Today, it's a virtue that's almost been lost. But in the ancient world, it was really important. And to invite somebody into your home, to share a meal with somebody was a sign of friendship. So in this instance, it looked for a moment as if Jesus is going to keep going, and that is until one of these two travelers invites him to stay. One of the things I hope you realize about Jesus is that he will never force his way in. Jesus is not the kind of person who invites himself to the party. If you don't want him to stay, he'll keep moving. You see that all throughout the Gospels. Jesus and his entourage would enter into some village where they would share the good news, and the people wouldn't respond, and Jesus and his disciples would shake the dust off their feet, and they'd move on to the next town. So Jesus, while he may knock at the door of your heart, he will never kick the door open. He will never force his way in. If you want him to stay, you have to invite him to stay. But here's the good news. Jesus always comes wherever he's invited. I mean, if you look at the story, all it takes is one sincere invitation, and Jesus immediately responds. He doesn't force his way in, but he immediately goes because he was invited. Romans 10, the Apostle Paul said it like this. He said, "Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." And again, for some of you here this morning, it could be that the reason you feel so beat up and so beat down and so hopeless is because you've never actually invited Jesus in. Maybe you've thought about it. Maybe there have been periods where you talked to other people about it. Maybe there have been seasons of your life when you felt like you were going to do it and you got really close to doing it, but for whatever reason, you never actually did it. And if that's your situation, I just want you to know, he's not going to force his way in. If you don't invite him to stay, he's not going to stay. But if you do invite him, he's promised to come. But there's something else you need to know about Jesus, and that's that when you invite him in, he's going to take control. When you get to the verse 30, the very next verse, there's this strange transition that takes place that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. These two people invite Jesus into the home, and almost immediately, Jesus takes over. Look at verse 30. It says, "When he was at the table with them, he took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them." Now make sure you catch this. Here's Jesus, And he started out as a guest, and almost immediately he becomes the host. He's sitting in somebody else's kitchen, dominating the conversation. He's in somebody else's house, and he's the one that's serving the meal and offering the prayer. And I don't know like how it works at your house, but whenever somebody comes to our house, their level of access depends on the depth of the relationship. Now, you know how this works. There are some people that come to your house, and the whole time they're there, your goal is to keep them on the front porch, right? Don't look at me. You know what I'm talking about. And then if they catch you like in a moment of weakness and they somehow make it inside the house, your goal becomes to keep them in the front room. You don't want to have to deal with this. You don't want them going. Now, there are other people that come to your house, and some of you are in this category. For me, you come to my house, and you just come in, and if you want something to drink, you go to the refrigerator and get it. If you want to take a nap, just have at it. If you want to do laundry, as long as you do some of mine, you know where the washing machine is. But other people, you kind of keep at arm's distance. Here's what we do. So many times, we invite Jesus in, and then after we do that, it's like we try to keep him on the front porch. And if he somehow gets past the door, we want to keep him in the front room because there's some areas we don't want him to look at. There's some things we don't want him to see. There's places that we don't want him to go. But the promise of Scripture is that when you invite him in, if you give him unlimited access, he'll do for you what you can never do for yourself. And that's exactly what happens. Go back to the verse 30 one more time. It says, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And then 31, then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the Scriptures to us? Here's the third step in this. At some point, you have to open your eyes. So they invite Jesus in. Here they are, and they're sitting around the table. And somehow, at the very moment Jesus breaks the bread, he begins to serve them. Their eyes are open, and they realize that it's Jesus himself sitting across the table from them. And I don't know what caused this. I mean, maybe they'd heard the story of what happened the previous Thursday night in the upper room. Maybe they just saw the scars embedded in the hands that now serve them. Or maybe there was something about the way that he prayed. But whatever it was, the light comes on. And after spending the biggest part of the day and into the early evening with him, they finally realized that the thing they had been desperately hoping for was actually right in front of them. The thing they had been dreaming about and working toward was right in front of them. You know, there are certain things, sometimes even things right in front of you, that you can't see till your eyes are open. Some of you here this morning, you've spent a big part of your life looking for an entire list of things: peace, love, direction, forgiveness, hope. And what I hope you'll walk away from this day knowing is that if the story of the resurrection is true, the thing that you've been looking for is right in front of you. And he has a name. The great writer C.S. Lewis said it this way. So the New Testament writers speak as if Christ's achievement in rising from the dead was the first event of its kind in the whole history of the universe. He is the first fruits, the pioneer of life. He has forced open a door that has been locked since the death of the first man. He has met, fought, and beaten the king of death. Everything is different because he's done so. Now, there's one more thing I want you to catch in this story. And that's that if you're going to learn to live with resurgent hope, you need to connect with the church. One of the weird things that happens in this story, I hope you picked it up as we read it, is at the end of verse 31, Luke tells us that immediately after they recognized him, Jesus disappeared from their sight, which seems strange, right? I mean, you think, all right, they spent all day together. You would think lingering questions, Jesus is going to hang out. That's not what happens, though. But don't let that mess with you, because here's what you need to know. Because they recognized him, because they had seen him with their own eyes, they had seen everything they needed to see. They knew everything they needed to know. But then in the very next verse, Luke tells us that the first thing they do after Jesus disappeared from their sight is they run the 7 miles back to Jerusalem, where they immediately join up with the other believers. Check this out, verse 33. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, saying, "It is true. The Lord is risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. It's hard to explain this, but a lot of you have experienced this. There is something about joining together with other people who have had their own experience with the resurrected Jesus that somehow gives us a fresh infusion of hope, even in the darkest circumstances. I have a picture I want to show you. 2 weeks ago, March 27th, a 28-year-old former student who was struggling with questions of gender identity shot through a locked door and entered the Covenant School, a private Christian school which is housed on the campus of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Nashville. Once inside, the shooter killed 6 people, including a substitute teacher, the school's principal, a much-loved custodian, and 3 9-year-old kids, including the only daughter of the church's pastor, 9-year-old Haley Scruggs. With those tragic deaths came a series of very difficult funerals, one of which that took place last Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock in the sanctuary of another church which is very nearby, Christ Presbyterian Church, as the members of the community gathered together to say goodbye to 9-year-old William Kinney, one of the victims of the shooting. After that funeral was over, the members of Covenant Presbyterian Church gathered again 2 hours later for their Sunday worship service, which they had moved to Sunday night so as not to interfere with William's funeral. How do you gather for a worship service after the funeral of a 9-year-old boy? The picture you see on the screen is a screenshot taken from that worship service. I went back and I watched it online this week, and they started by singing a series of classic hymns, songs like "God, Our Help in Ages Past," "Abide with Me," and "O Love That Will Not Let Me Go." If you go back and watch it, I want you to listen to how they sang. Literally unbelievable after everything they've been through. After they were done singing, there was a guy named Billy Barnes who serves as the executive pastor of the church, and he preached a sermon about the story that we looked at this morning, the story of the 2 travelers on the road to Emmaus. And about 10 minutes into his message, he explained how after these 2 travelers realized it was Jesus to whom they'd been talking, they immediately ran back to Jerusalem to share the news with the other believers, where Luke says they assembled together. And he followed that up by talking about it's in those dramatic moments, the highs and the lows, that we need each other most. Then, through tear-filled eyes and with a halting voice, he looked up at a church filled with broken-hearted people and families with seats that are now empty. He said this. He said, "A lot of things have changed this week, but some things didn't change. And in this story, these 2 travelers saw the thing that didn't change, that Jesus is the King and that He's on His throne. He's alive." Then a few minutes later, he ended his sermon by quoting a song popular several years ago. It was titled, "Is He Worthy?" It was written by Andrew Peterson, made popular by Chris Tomlin. If you haven't heard the song, it's really unique. It's kind of got this old school call and response thing that we don't see much anymore. And the lead singer will ask a question, and then the question will be answered by this choir of voices. And I'm not going to try to sing this song to you, but I do want you to listen to it. It starts out, and the lead singer asks this question: "Do you feel the world is broken?" The choir answers, "We do." "Do you feel the shadows deepen?" We do. "But do you know that all the dark won't stop the light from getting through?" We do. "Do you wish that you could see it all made new?" We do. Then it goes into the second verse. "Is all creation groaning?" It is. "Is a new creation coming?" It is. "Is the glory of the Lord to be the light within our midst?" It is. Is it good to remind ourselves of this? It is. And then comes the chorus. "Is anyone worthy? Is anyone whole? Is anyone able to break the seal and open the scroll? The Lion of Judah who conquered the grave, he was David's root and the Lamb who died to ransom the slave. Does the Father truly love us?" He does. Does the Spirit move among us? He does. And does Jesus, our Messiah, hold forever those He loves? The answer comes. He does. A lot of different reasons people come to church on Easter. But whatever your reason for being here today, I want you to know you are not suffering anything but a good resurrection. I want you to stand with me. If you're here and you need a fresh infusion of hope, we want you to know that hope has a name, and His name is Jesus. So if you don't know Him, if you've never invited Him in, maybe you feel the need to pray with somebody, maybe you have questions about what your next step would look like, we'd be glad to talk with you. All you need to do, we're going to sing some songs together, and as a part of our celebration of the resurrection, if you want to pray with somebody, you want to talk to somebody, you just meet us on this front row.